Wyoming Territory, 1889. Tom Wheatley had walked more long roads in his 30 years than he cared to count. He had walked into bunkhouses at the tail end of drives with his boots ruined and his hands raw, and walked out again 3 weeks later with pay in his pocket and no place particular to go. He had spent the whole of his working life moving cattle up trails other men had claimed and mending fences around land other men had settled. And every winter he told himself the next spring would be different, and every spring it was the same. He was good with horses and better with cattle and unremarkable at everything else that mattered in the world, which was most things. He had ridden 4 days from Cheyenne after hearing at a stockman's supper that a small ranch outside the town of Sweetwater Bend was working short-handed and looking for a man who could throw a rope and read a brand. The country west of Cheyenne was hard and beautiful in equal measure, red rock and sage, and the wide sky pressing down on everything. And Tom rode through it thinking about how much of it belonged to somebody, and how little of that somebody was ever him. The ranch sat where the directions said it would, tucked against a low ridge with the North Platte curling silver in the distance. It was a good place. He could see that from a quarter-mile away. The barn was tight, the corrals were sound, and the main house was small but built to last. The kind of place that had been made by someone who intended to stay, and was still being kept by someone who refused to leave. He tied his gelding at the hitching rail and climbed the porch steps and knocked. The woman who opened the door was 24 years old, fair-haired, dressed in a dark green wool dress with a white collar and a pencil tucked behind her ear. Her eyes were the pale blue of a hard sky, and they took him in the way a rancher takes in a stray calf, top to bottom, deciding immediately whether it was worth the trouble. She held a sheaf of papers in her left hand, and she did not lower them when she opened the door. Tom took his hat off. "Ma'am, I'm told you might be short a hand for spring works. I'm a good worker, I know cattle, and I can. I don't need a cowboy," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I need a husband." She said it the way you might read out the weather, without embarrassment or apology, as if it were a fact established by long arithmetic rather than by feeling. Tom stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and his prepared speech coming apart in his mouth. He had knocked on many doors in his life and had many things said to him at many doors, and this was not among them. He looked at her the way a man looks when he isn't sure whether he heard right and is deciding whether to ask. "Come inside," she said. "I'll explain." She turned and walked back into the house without waiting to see if he would follow, still carrying the papers. Tom stood on the porch a moment longer, looking at the door she had left open behind her. Then he stepped inside, because what else does a man do when a woman like that opens a door and walks away from it expecting nothing in particular, and getting exactly what she expected? Her name was Sarah Beaumont. Her husband Ellis had been killed the previous October, thrown by a green colt he was breaking in the West Corral, his neck snapped clean before the dust had settled. He had been 27 years old. He had left her with 240 acres of deeded land along the North Platte, another 400 acres of grazing lease from the Territorial Land Office, 84 head of shorthorn cattle, 3 horses, 1 dog, and a note at the First Cattlemen's Bank of Sweetwater Bend for $580, borrowed the previous February to buy breeding stock that had not yet paid for itself. Under Wyoming Territory's property statutes in 1889, a widow's position was better than it had been in her mother's day, but not by as much as the newspapers liked to claim. The estate was still in probate. The grazing lease could not be renewed in her name alone, without a legal fight that would take longer than the lease had left to run. And the bank, in the person of a man named Everett Corliss, had made it politely and repeatedly clear that a widow of 24 with a note that size and no husband to sign renewal papers was not a customer the bank could keep on its books past the spring calling of accounts. She laid all of this out at the kitchen table with the papers spread between them and a pot of coffee gone half cold, the way a woman lays out the pieces of a broken harness she has stared at every night for 6 months looking for a way to mend it. Her hands were steady on the papers. Her voice did not rise or fall. She had told herself this story many times. Tom understood, and the ending had never once changed on her. Without a husband's signature on the lease renewal and the note extension, I lose the grazing lease in April and the note comes due in July, Sarah said. Without the grazing lease, 84 head of cattle can't winter on 240 acres. Without the herd, I can't make the note. Without making the note, I lose the deeded land too. She looked up. I've been over it. There isn't another road. Tom turned his hat slowly in his hands. You're proposing a business arrangement. I'm proposing a marriage that starts as one, she said. You'd have a home, $30 a month once the note is extended, and a quarter share of the operation as it stands. In return, I need your name on 2 documents at the land office and 1 at the bank, and I need your hands on this ranch. He looked at her across the table. You don't know me. No, she said, but you rode up here looking for honest work. You took your hat off on my porch, and you didn't grin at me when I said what I said. She squared the papers on the table. That puts you ahead of the last 3 men I asked. He raised his eyebrows a little at that. 3. One laughed. One asked what else came with the arrangement in a way I didn't care for. And one said he'd think about it and rode straight to town to tell the story at the saloon before dark. She said this without heat, the way a person reports on the weather they have already lived through. You have until morning to decide. There's supper on the stove. The bunk in the barn is clean and the stove out there works. I'd rather you slept there tonight regardless of your answer. Tom nodded once. That's fair. He ate supper alone at the kitchen table while Sarah worked at her papers in the front room, the lamplight catching the edge of her hair through the doorway. The food was plain and good, beef and beans and cornbread, the kind of supper made by someone who cooked because people needed to eat and not because she had anything to prove about it. When he was done, he washed his plate at the basin and set it in the rack the way it had been set, and then he took his hat from the peg by the door and walked out into the Wyoming dusk toward the barn. The sky over the ridge was the color of a bruised turning. There was a rider on the high ground half a mile east, sitting a dark horse against the last of the light, watching the house. Tom stopped at the corner of the barn and looked at him for a long moment, not making a show of it, just looking. The rider sat there another half-minute and then turned his horse and walked it down the far side of the ridge and out of sight. Tom filed that away and went into the barn. It was, as she had said, clean. The stalls were mucked and the hay was fresh, and the tack was oiled and hung in order on the wall. A neglected place always showed in the tack first, in the cracked leather and the rust on the bit rings, and there was none of that here. The little pot-belly stove in the corner of the bunk room had wood laid in it ready to be lit, and a striker set beside it, and a folded blanket on the cot that smelled of soap and cedar. He lit the stove and sat on the edge of the cot and pulled his boots off slowly, thinking. He had spent 30 years moving because nothing had ever given him a reason to stop, and he had told himself, more or less continuously across those 30 years, that this was what freedom looked like. A man with a bedroll and a good horse and no debts owed to anyone was a man the world could not lay hands on. That was the story. He had told it to himself in bunkhouses from the Rio Grande to the Powder River, and he had almost believed it most nights. What he was beginning to understand, sitting in a stranger's barn in Wyoming territory with a stove ticking as it warmed, was that a man who could not be laid hands on was also a man who could not lay hands on anything. He had never driven a nail into a board that was his. He had never planted a post in ground that would still be his ground in the morning. He had listened his whole life for a certain echo and never heard it, because you could not hear that echo off borrowed wood. Sarah Beaumont had asked him a strange question at her kitchen table. Under the strangeness of it, he could feel the shape of an answer that had been waiting for him a long time. He thought about the rider on the ridge, too. He thought about a woman alone on 240 acres with 84 head of cattle and a note coming due, and about how many men in a country like this one might look at a situation like that and see not a woman but an opportunity waiting to be taken. He blew out the lamp and lay back on the cot and watched the stove throw its small orange light against the wall. In the morning, he walked to the kitchen at first light. Sarah was already at the stove. Coffee going, bacon in the skillet, the papers from the night before squared in a neat stack on the corner of the table with a river stone laid on top of them to hold them down. She looked up when he came in, and Tom saw in her face the same measuring look she had given him at the door, the one that took in the whole of a man before it decided what to do about him. "Yes," he said. She held his eyes for a moment. She did not smile exactly. What crossed her face was the small, controlled breath of a person who had been carrying a stone for a long time and had just felt someone else take hold of the other end of it. "Sit down," she said. "Eat first. Then we'll ride to town." They were married that Friday afternoon at the parsonage on 3rd Street in Sweetwater Bend by the Reverend Aldous Price, with the Reverend's wife and a bookkeeper named Harriet Cobb standing witness. Sarah wore a dove-gray dress with a small collar of ivory lace and her mother's cameo at her throat. Tom wore his clean shirt and a borrowed jacket that fit him well enough at the shoulders and not at all at the wrists. The ceremony took 12 minutes. The Reverend, who had heard the shape of the arrangement before he agreed to perform it, spoke the words with the same care he would have given any other couple, and when he pronounced them man and wife, he did not linger on the phrase and he did not look away from it either. On the walk back to the wagon, Sarah said, "Thank you," Tom said. "I'd like to look at the herd books tonight if that suits. I want to know what we're working with before Monday." She glanced at him sideways under the brim of her bonnet. "All right," she said, and then, after a moment, Ellis kept 2 sets of books, the main ledger and a separate one for the grazing lease. "They don't always agree. I'll want to see both." "You will." Something at the corner of her mouth moved that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. They passed the feed store on the way to the wagon, and Tom noticed a heavy-set man in a good black coat standing on the boardwalk under the awning, a cigar between his fingers, watching the wagon come by with the still, attentive look of a man reading a page he had not expected to find in his morning paper. He was maybe 50, clean-shaven, prosperous in the particular way of a man who owned other men's time. Sarah did not turn her head, but Tom saw her jaw set a small degree harder as they passed him. "Who's the gentleman with the cigar?" Tom asked once they were past. "Silas Whitcomb," she said, and did not elaborate. "Rancher. Owns the Bar W east of the river, 9,000 acres, runs about 2,000 head. She flicked the reins lightly. "He's been trying to buy this place for 4 years. He offered Ellis 3 times and Ellis turned him down 3 times. He offered me twice after Ellis died. I turned him down twice." Tom looked back over his shoulder once quickly, and Whitcomb was still standing on the boardwalk, still watching, the cigar untouched. "He didn't look surprised," Tom said. "No," Sarah said. "He looked like a man rearranging his plans." Tom faced forward and did not look back again. The first weeks were nothing but work. Tom was up before the light and out past sundown, and there was always more of the ranch than there was of him. The east fence had rotted posts every 4th span. The corral gate hung on one hinge and needed a full rebuild. The barn roof shed water well enough, but the ridge cap was loose in 3 places and would not survive another hard winter without attention. The stock tank at the north end of the deeded land had silted up and had to be dug out by hand. He worked through the list the way a man works through a list, one item at a time, in the order that mattered most, and he asked Sarah questions the way a man asks when he is trying to understand a place, and not when he is trying to look like he already does. She answered him with the flat, efficient patience of a woman who had explained this ranch to herself every morning for 6 months just to keep from going under. She showed him the pasture rotation Ellis had used. She showed him the 2 herd books and where they disagreed and why. She walked him along the boundary with the grazing lease and pointed out the survey markers and the places where the markers had been moved or removed or never set. She did not soften anything. She did not oversell anything. She said, "This is what we have, this is what we owe, this is what it will take." The meeting at the bank happened on a Tuesday. Everett Corliss was a narrow man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of careful courtesy that a certain kind of banker used as a substitute for warmth. He shook Tom's hand and did not shake Sarah's, and he addressed his 3 preliminary questions about the property directly to Tom without so much as a glance in her direction. Tom answered all 3 from memory. the exact acreage of the deeded parcel, the current head count broken down by age and sex, the date of the grazing lease renewal, and the number of the section it covered. Corliss blinked once behind his spectacles, and then a second time, and then he opened the note extension paperwork and slid it across the desk with a small, revised expression on his face that Tom did not miss. Out on the boardwalk afterward, Sarah stopped walking. "You answered every one of those questions without looking at me," she said. "I read the ledger. You read the whole ledger. I needed to know what I was married to." She looked at him for a long moment with her pale blue eyes doing something behind them that he could not read. Then she started walking again, faster than before, and she did not speak the rest of the way to the wagon. What Tom did not tell her, riding home that afternoon with the note extension folded in the inside pocket of his coat, was that while reading the second of the two Herd books he had found something that had made him sit up straighter at the kitchen table well after midnight. It was a short entry in Ellis's careful, slanted hand, dated the previous August, 2 months before the colt threw him. "Whitcomb's man Kearns at the North Waterhole again. 3rd time this month. Says he's tracking strays. No strays. Ask Judge Farrow about the 1881 filing on Section 14 before fall term." Ellis had never asked Judge Farrow anything. Ellis had been dead 6 weeks later. Tom folded that piece of information away in the same quiet part of himself where he kept the rider on the ridge and the man with the cigar on the boardwalk, and he rode on beside his wife toward the ranch. Sweetwater Bend had opinions about the marriage. Of course it did. Harriet Cobb, the bookkeeper, who had stood witness at the parsonage and who kept accounts for half the merchants in town, reported to anyone who asked, and several who did not, that Sarah Beaumont had married a stranger she had known for a single afternoon, that the stranger appeared to know his business with cattle, and that the whole arrangement was either the smartest thing that woman had done since her husband died or the beginning of a slow disaster. She was withholding her verdict, she said, pending further evidence. The evidence, as the weeks turned into a month and the month turned into 2, tended in the direction of the first possibility. The fences went up straight. The corral gate swung true. The stock tank held water. The cattle came off the winter range in better condition than the neighbors' cattle did. And when Tom rode into town for salt and nails and a new file for the whetstone, he paid cash and did not linger at the saloon. And men who had been prepared to think one thing about him began, slowly and against their inclination, to think another. Silas Whitcomb did not come to the ranch. Whitcomb's foreman, a lean, sun-cured man named Josiah Kearns, came instead. He came on a Thursday in late April, riding the boundary at a walk, following the line of the grazing lease from the south end to the north as if he were counting the posts. Tom was setting a corner post at the northeast angle when Kearns rode up and stopped his horse 10 feet off. "You're the new husband," Kearns said. "Tom Wheatley." "Kearns, bar W, I know who you are." Kearns looked at the post, at the depth of the hole, at the way the wire had been strung and tensioned. He was a man who understood fences the way a doctor understands a pulse. "That's a deep set. Ground's soft here. Shallow won't hold past a hard freeze." "No," Kearns said, "it won't." He rolled a cigarette one-handed while his horse stood, and he lit it, and he looked north across the grazing lease toward the low country by the river. "You know that grazing lease comes up for renewal in a bit under 2 weeks. I know. You know the boundary on Section 14 has been in question since about 1881. Tom set his post-hole digger down and looked at Kearns directly. "I've heard something about it. Old filing," Kearns said, drawing on the cigarette. "Never properly resolved. Land office in Cheyenne has the paperwork somewhere. Man could spend a lot of time chasing it. Meanwhile, the lease sits in limbo, and a woman with a note at the bank and cattle on that grass has some hard math to do." "A married woman," Tom said. Kearns smiled a small, thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Married woman, sure." He looked at the corner post one more time, and then he touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers and turned his horse and rode south along the fence line at the same measured walk he had come up in. Tom watched him go until he was a small shape against the sagebrush, and then he picked up the digger and drove the blade into the ground and set to work again. 3 clean strokes. Then he stopped, and he stood there a long moment with his hands on the digger, looking east toward the ridge where the rider had sat the first night. That evening, after supper, he wrote a letter to Judge Amos Farrow in Cheyenne. I want to stop here for just a moment. You know what stays with me about Sarah's situation, about what she was actually facing on that porch when Tom came riding up. The law in 1889 did not just take a woman's husband from her. It left her standing in a place where men she had never spoken to could sign papers about her land and her cattle and her livelihood, and where the only door out of that place was another man's signature at the bottom of another form. She looked at that door, and she walked through it with her head up, and she asked a stranger the hardest question she had ever asked anyone. That took something most of us don't have to find in ourselves in a lifetime. This channel is still finding its footing, and if this story has traveled with you from Nigeria or Brazil or India or the Philippines or Mexico or South Africa or anywhere the internet has carried these voices tonight, I want you to know I see you, and I am grateful you wrote in. If Sarah and Tom have any hold on you at all, tap subscribe before the next section starts. It keeps the fire going on this end, and it means we get to keep telling nights like this one. Now let's ride on, because the letter to Judge Farrow is going in the mail on Monday, and the answer that comes back is going to change what the summer of 1889 looks like for everyone on the Beaumont place. Judge Amos Farrow was 68 years old, a widower, a man who had ridden circuit in the territory since before the railroad reached Cheyenne, and a man who kept his own counsel about a great many things. His reply came back in the second week of May in a plain envelope with no return address, written in his precise copperplate hand on a single sheet of court stationery. Tom read it standing at the mailbox at the end of the ranch road, and then he read it again on the walk back to the house, and then he sat down on the porch step and read it a third time before he went inside. The judge's letter said that yes, he remembered the 1881 filing on Section 14. He remembered it well. It had been filed by a man named Ephraim Beaumont, Ellis's father, and it was a corrective plat resolving an error in the original 1876 survey that had placed the section corner 120 yards south of its true position. The corrective plat had been filed properly with the land office in Cheyenne. It had been recorded properly with the county clerk in Sweetwater Bend. And then, at some point between 1883 and 1887, the county clerk's copy had gone missing from the record books. The judge went on. The land office copy in Cheyenne still existed. He had checked. It was on file in Volume 14, page 227 of the territorial records. Anyone who wished to establish the true boundary of Section 14, as it pertained to the Beaumont grazing lease, had only to request a certified copy of that filing and present it to the county clerk in Sweetwater Bend, at which point the missing county record would have to be reconstructed from the territorial original, and the boundary would be settled beyond further argument. The judge closed with a single sentence. Mr. Wheatley, I have known the Beaumont family for 30 years, and I would consider it a personal courtesy if you would ride to Cheyenne yourself and collect the certified copy from my clerk in person. Tom folded the letter and went inside to find his wife. Sarah was at the kitchen table with the herd book open in front of her and a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow. She looked up when he came in, and she read his face before he had crossed the room, the way she read everything. "You've had news," she said. He set the letter on the table in front of her and sat down across from her and waited while she read it. She read it once through without moving, and then she read it a second time with one finger tracking down the page, and then she set it down and pressed her palms flat against the tabletop on either side of it and did not look up for a full half-minute. "You wrote to Judge Farrow," she said finally, 2 weeks ago. "You did not tell me." "No," she looked up then. Her eyes had the pale, hard shine of a person deciding whether to be angry, and Tom held the look and did not look away. "Why?" she said. "Because I did not know what shape it was in yet. I did not want to hand you a fear until I could hand you something to do about it in the same hand." She looked at him a long moment. Something in her face reorganized itself slowly, the way weather changes over open country. She looked down at the letter again. Ellis knew about the plat, she said quietly. He must have known. His father filed it. He knew, Tom said. There's an entry in the second book. Last August. He was going to ask the judge about it before the fall term. He didn't get the chance. She was very still. You found that in the book. Second night I was here. She let out a small breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. You have been carrying this since the second night. I have been learning the shape of it since the second night. There is a difference. She looked at him then in a way she had not looked at him before, and Tom felt in his chest the small shift a man feels when the ground under him settles into place. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly once and took it back. Ride to Cheyenne, she said. I will handle the ranch. He rode out the next morning at dawn. 4 days to Cheyenne, 1 day at the land office and Judge Farrow's chambers, 4 days back. He rode a good gray gelding and led a pack horse, and carried a Winchester in a scabbard, and a letter of introduction from Sarah in his coat pocket. And he took the long way where it made sense to take it, and the fast way where it did not. And he watched his back trail every evening before he made his camp. On the 5th night out he was camped in a draw north of Chugwater Creek with his horses hobbled and a small fire burning low, and he heard a horse coming down the draw behind him at a walk. He put the coffee pot aside and moved into the darkness beyond the fire with the Winchester in his hands, and he waited. The rider came in slow, hands visible, calling out before he was within pistol range. Wheatley, Kearns, don't shoot me. I'm alone and I'd like to talk. Tom did not answer for a long moment. Then he said from the darkness, Step down, keep your hands where I can see them. Kearns swung down slow and easy and stood beside his horse with his hands out at his sides where the firelight could find them. He was dusty and travel-worn, and he looked like a man who had ridden hard for 2 days to catch up to another man who did not want to be caught up to. I'm not here for Whitcomb, Kearns said. I quit the Bar W 4 days ago. Rode out the same morning you did. Took me a while to cut your trail. Tom did not lower the Winchester. Talk. Kearns talked. He talked for the better part of an hour, sitting on a rock across the low fire from Tom with a tin cup of coffee in his hands and his hat pushed back on his head. He said he had ridden for Silas Whitcomb for 11 years. He said he had done things in those 11 years that had sat all right with him at the time, and had begun, in the last year or two, to sit different. He said the business with the Beaumont place was one of those things. He said he had been the one who took the corrective plat out of the county clerk's record book in the winter of 1885, on Whitcomb's instruction, and he said he had known even then that it was not a thing a man walked back from once he had done it. He said Whitcomb had not killed Ellis Beaumont. The colt had killed Ellis Beaumont, and the colt had been green and Ellis had been careless, and that was the whole of that. But he said Whitcomb had watched the funeral from the ridge above the burying ground and had ridden back to the Bar W that afternoon and had said, out loud, at his own supper table, that the good Lord worked in a hurry sometimes when a man had been patient long enough. He said Whitcomb had a plan for the 2 weeks between the grazing lease expiration and the county clerk, figuring out which set of records to believe. He said the plan involved 60 head of Bar W cattle pushed onto Section 14 the first night after the lease lapsed, and a hired lawyer out of Laramie who had already been paid a retainer, and a story about long-standing use and disputed boundary that would tie the Beaumont place up in territorial court until Sarah could not make the note at the bank. Tom listened all of this out without moving. When Kearns was done, Tom said, Why are you telling me this? Kearns looked into the fire. My wife died last spring, he said. Consumption took her 4 months. I sat with her the whole 4 months, and I had a lot of time to think about the kind of ledger a man carries into the ground with him. I looked at mine, and I did not like what was written in it. He looked up. I am 47 years old. I have some years left. I would like to spend them writing on a different page. Tom set the Winchester across his knees. I am riding to Cheyenne for the certified copy of the plat, he said. I will be back in Sweetwater Bend in 4 days. If you ride back now and you are on my porch when I get home, and you are willing to swear to what you just told me in front of Judge Farrow when he comes for the fall term, Then you and I will have a conversation about what comes next. If you are not on my porch, then we will not." Kieran stood up slow. He set the tin cup down beside the fire. "I will be on your porch," he said. Kieran's was on the porch when Tom rode in at sundown 4 days later, sitting on the top step with his hat on his knee, and his horse tied at the rail, and Sarah standing in the doorway behind him with her arms folded, and her pale eyes doing the arithmetic on him. Tom swung down and shook Kieran's hand once, and then he walked past him into the house and laid the certified copy of the 1881 plat on the kitchen table in front of his wife, and Sarah looked down at it for a long time without speaking. The certified copy went to the county clerk on Monday morning. The reconstructed record was entered into the county book the following Thursday. The grazing lease was renewed in Sarah Wheatley's name for a term of 10 years on the Friday after that, with the true boundary of Section 14 recorded on the face of the lease in the county clerk's own hand. Judge Farrow rode down from Cheyenne for the fall term in September, and Josiah Kieran sat in his chambers on a Wednesday afternoon and swore out his affidavit in front of the judge and 2 witnesses. And by the first snow of 1889, Silas Whitcomb had sold the Bar W to a syndicate out of Denver and moved his household to St. Louis, and no one in Sweetwater Bend was sorry to see him go. The note at the First Cattlemen's Bank was extended on terms that Everett Corliss called, with the small revised expression of a man who had learned something, quite favorable. Tom took no salary the first year and put every dollar the ranch generated back into the herd and the fences and the roof. Sarah found this out in November when she went through the books, and she did not raise it with him for 3 weeks, and when she raised it by pushing the ledger across the table without a word and letting the numbers speak for themselves. "The place needed it," Tom said. "So did you," Sarah said. He looked up at her across the table. "I have what I need," he said. She looked at him a long moment with the lamplight on her hair, and the stove ticking in the corner, and the dog asleep on the rag rug by the door. And then she stood up from her side of the table and came around to his, and she kissed him once slowly, with the whole considered weight of a woman who made her decisions the long way and kept them the long way. And Tom kissed her back with the certainty of a man who had spent 30 years driving nails into other men's boards, and had finally driven one into wood that was his. Outside, the Wyoming winter was coming down onto the ranch they had decided together to keep, and the fences were straight and the herd was in the low pasture, and the note was on schedule, and Josiah Kieran's was in the bunkhouse he had rebuilt with his own hands, and inside the kitchen was warm and the coffee was on, and it was, by every measure Sarah Wheatley had ever used, exactly right. The greatest adventure in the West was never the long ride, and it was never the open trail. It was always the moment somebody decided to stop and to plant a post and to stay long enough to hear the echo change. Sarah asked. Tom walked inside. The rest was the work, and the work, as it turned out, was the whole point. "Thank you for riding with me tonight. Wherever you are, I am grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding."